Um, so hey everyone, I'm Yves Junqueira, founder and CEO of YourBase.io. I'm here with Quinn on the other side of this call. He's the founder and CEO of Sourcegraph. So Quinn's team recently announced that they're open sourcing Sourcegraph. So as the founder of a new developer infrastructure company myself and a user of Sourcegraph, I have a million questions for Quinn. And I talked to him and he generously agreed to record our conversation in case it's useful for other developers and other entrepreneurs. So, hey, Quinn, how are you today?
Good. Yves, good to talk with you. Excited to talk about these topics. Spent a lot of time thinking about it, so I'm glad to have someone I can talk about this with nonstop for 30 minutes and who's interested.
Yes, that'd be great. Um, could you just talk very briefly about what is Sourcegraph and who uses Sourcegraph and why?
Yes, Sourcegraph is a product for developers that lets them search and browse their code. So it's for all those times when you're coding and you have some question. How do I do this? Who wrote this? Why did this break? And we built it to be the fastest way to find that answer. In the same way that when you want to, answer any of a million kinds of questions, you go to Google. Well, it turns out if, you are working on your code, then Sourcegraph is that oracle that answers all your questions for you. And it's code search and browsing, really simple.
So is it for my code or for other people's code?
It's for your code. And it turns out your code probably includes a lot of open source. And if that means, whatever question you need to answer means you need to go research how some open source project implements it, either to debug an issue or to copy their implementation, then it's for other people's code too.
Oh, that makes sense. But suppose I have a private repository, right? And maybe an enterprise version of GitHub. How does that work?
You run Sourcegraph on your own infrastructure for private code. One thing I think we'll talk about this from a business model point of view is for any company like us that makes a product that deals with sensitive data, we have two choices. We can either offer a cloud service where companies send their code up to our servers and we host them and they got to trust us and all that, or we can ship our product so they run it on their own infra. And we chose the latter. So we don't host any private code. You can just run Sourcegraph on your own network. And turns out that's free. That's actually open source too. So we made a lot of choices to make that easy. And that's something that was not immediately obvious when we were starting. And it still isn't to a lot of people because everyone thinks, oh, everything is moving to the cloud, but not everything. The easiest way to understand that is if you're listening, is all of your code on the cloud? Maybe it's on GitHub's servers, but is it on the clouds of like many different companies? Do you trust all those companies? Probably not. And so that's why we made Sourcegraph so you could run it on your own infra.
Interesting. So how does it work? Do I download Tarball and then I run? What's the deployment? Like, is it a Docker image? How does that work?
Yeah, Docker image, or if you want high scale, you can go Kubernetes. But the simple one is just Docker run. We have a little command on our site, and then you have a server on localhost :3080.
I see. So I've used Sourcegraph for your open source. Your public instance of Sourcegraph, and my preferred way to use Sourcegraph is through godoc.org when I'm navigating Go code. And there's a link near any of the functions, and I click on that link, and then it goes to Sourcegraph as far as I recall, and then it gives me it lists public code that actually uses that function, and I find this incredibly useful. But then recently, when talking with you actually, or with Beyond, you guys mentioned that I could also install the extension. And when I install the extension, now when I'm navigating GitHub, every code is essentially augmented now with Sourcegraph's really, really nice UI and cross-search, cross-reference capabilities. So that's pretty cool. So
Yeah.
if I install this, if I have a private instance of Sourcegraph, does the extension also work seamlessly?
Yeah. So I'm glad you mentioned the extension. It's kind of like our sidewalk project. So we like to think if you're walking down the sidewalk, no matter where you are in San Francisco or, you're on vacation somewhere and you're walking down the sidewalk and someone says, oh, hey, what does Sourcegraph do? Well, the thing we say is get the browser extension. It turns GitHub into an IDE with go to definition. And that's something that 99.9% of people find useful. So yeah, that works on open source code. You install it, you just go to an open source code file, you get hovers, go to definition. It also works on your private code. And that's like, if you got to think about how have we grown as a business, it's having that really simple thing that 99.9% of our audience finds appealing, and that then has a nice on-ramp into using it for more of your code, using it for private code. And eventually, that's one of the things that gets us really strong usage inside companies, because it's easy to imagine if you have 3,000 developers that you can roll out the browser extension to every single one of them. And it's something that every single one of them, basically is going to use every day. So it's nice to have something like that. That has a different kind of product dynamic than a product that people have to like affirmatively choose to use each time. That's also a valuable part of the product to have, but it's good to have both.
Oh, that's very interesting. So you recently open sourced. So you have this part of the product that is like very popular, that everybody uses, right? That a lot of people uses. And then you have a part of your product that, let's say, enterprises and companies are pay for, right? So I assume you only open sourced the public version, like the public part of it. So can you explain what is open source? You couldn't have possibly open sourced everything.
Well, someday, maybe we will. But for now, our model is we love freemium. Freemium is the really common pricing thing that all kinds of businesses use. And it's give away a lot of features for free that let people know, use, trust your product. Mm-hmm. And then you charge for other features. But we've taken it one step further. It's when we say freemium, all the stuff that's free of charge is also free software. So everything that is paid, that's still non-open source. There have been some companies actually that have the closed source part of their code, but they actually make that code visible, which is useful sometimes if you're a customer, you want to know, I can audit this code. GitLab does a great job of that. For us, we'll probably do that eventually, but there's some confusion there where people might think that the whole thing is open source, or it might not be clear. So we wanted our initial announcement of being open source to be really clear about what is open source and what's in the paid part of the
product. What surprised me is that your core technology, your indexing of source code seems to be open source, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, our principle is that anything that is more really for bigger organizations should be paid and closed source. That's how we can fund development of the rest of it. But anything for developers that they use, that they could actually contribute to, that should be open source. And our view is that that's the best way to do it, period. You could think of some cases where that makes it slightly harder for us to make money, like, maybe we could charge developers a little bit for these things. But we want to have a simple business model where it's really clear we're making a big bet that every developer will be using a product like Sourcegraph in the future, because Google and Facebook devs use it. We have a lot of big tech company customers that use it. And so we don't want to risk slowing down that growth or muddying our internal execution or vision just to get a few more dollars from developers here and there when we think that this is going to spread really quickly. And there's plenty of money to be made by charging companies that are getting a lot of value from it. So we're not trying to get every single, penny and nickel and dime on the sidewalk. We're trying to find who are the people that really have a burning need for Sourcegraph, and let's make it so that it grows as quickly and it gets to their radar, gets on their radar, and then let's go charge them. I view this in the same way of when you have like a new encryption scheme. There are two ways to do it. One, you could, make it really complex and make it so there's like 5 different points where there's secrecy and, the username is secret. The private key is secret. The algorithm is secret. And in the end, that creates a less secure system than if you just had one secret material. We want to have one place where we make money. And that is when a big company or a medium-sized company is using Sourcegraph, and not try to, introduce all these other blockers along the way to people using our product.
That's amazing. Do you have, what license do you use?
We use
For,
Apache too.
mm-hmm.
We talked about this internally. We had some other crazy ideas about dual licensing under MIT and Apache too, like how the Rust project does it. But in the end, we wanted to pick the one that was most obviously, simply open source and permissive. And I think we did that with Apache too.
That's great. Do you expect when you open source, since it's open source, do you also expect other technologies to be built on top of Sourcegraph, either as integrations or just people hacking it themselves or hosting it themselves a lot? What do you expect to change now that it's open source? Well, I would expect that at least you're getting more contributors, and those people are maybe perhaps actually contributing features. Could there also be more integrations that you can imagine with
Yeah,
Sourcegraph?
I think so. But before I go into all that, you always got to be careful when you open source something, because it never works out that you open source it and then, oh man, all these contributors come by, they contribute so many amazing patches, there's no overhead. That's a rosy scenario that basically never works out. So we wanted to make sure that we had a robust justification for open sourcing.
Mm.
And the way that we looked at it is, even if only this one thing happened, it would be worth it. If it only made developers slightly more likely to talk about Sourcegraph when they saw it. I know that I'm a lot more likely to, go talk about or tweet about some tool I used if it's open source rather than commercial. I'm not sure exactly why, like it maybe shouldn't make a difference, but I get more excited about open source things. So all we needed is for that to be true. And that's a coefficient that has exponential effects. Each developer has a slightly higher probability of passing it on. And, it turns out that's the way that we spread via word of mouth. And if we can increase that key driver, then that's really good. With that said, I think Sourcegraph is the kind of project that will get meaningful contributions. We have already gotten some meaningful contributions from the open source community, both to the core and to the platform we're building. So the platform we're building, I mean, think of if you are using your editor all day long, all week long, you might build an extension for it to integrate with some language that you like or some tool that you like. Same thing with Sourcegraph. If you're using Sourcegraph alongside your editor all day long, you're using it in GitHub, in GitLab, you're using it for searches all the time, you're reading a lot of code in it. Well, that same instinct is going to make you want to write an extension for Sourcegraph, something that overlays it with code coverage, something that adds support for new language to it, something that will look through and let you see what is the most recent PR for a given line, and then jump to that discussion history. And we think that not only those extensions can make Sourcegraph better, but since we're so integrated with the code host, with your code review tool, you can see all those things in those tools. So that's what Sourcegraph extensions is. And we wanted to make it as easy as possible for people to write those. Being open source is a big part of that. So even though extensions, in the same way with an editor extension, you don't actually fork the editor, you build it on top of the editor. You're a lot more likely to do that if the editor is open source, and the same principle applies to Sourcegraph. It's an open source platform. That means you're more likely to build on top of it. So that's what we expect to see. And just in the last few days, we've seen some cool extensions starting to be built. One that will add links to GoDoc when you're looking at a Go file. All the imports up top, you can get GoDoc links. Someone else is making it so if you have like a http.handle and then some URL path, you can see what are all the client calls like http.get to that same path, and some other cool like cross-language RPC code intelligence. So we're excited about those. And I don't think those things would have been built if we were closed source.
Oh, that makes sense. If I wanted to learn more about those extensions getting built now, or if I wanted to learn more about how do I make my own extensions, where can I go?
Just look up Sourcegraph extensions. The repo is Sourcegraph Extension API on GitHub.
So there's a repo already for this.
Yeah.
Oh, that's exciting. So you mentioned that being open source makes it easier for developers to talk about Sourcegraph, right? Makes it easier for your message to spread. Could you talk a little bit more about that? How does that translate? Like, for example, does it make any difference with regards to how you participate in conferences? How is that going to work exactly?
Yeah, I think it will change how we interact at conferences. And already, I think we have a slightly different philosophy than some other companies. And I'll lay it out like this. I think each person has a limited number of years and hours on this planet, and
Hmm.
everyone would like to be working on meaningful things.
Hmm.
It is so meaningful when you work on a project where you are actually excited by it. You actually, when your friends are talking, you actually share that you're excited about working on this. You actually tell your friends, I think you should get this. And whenever you say that, even if what you're working on is total nonprofit and non-commercial, you still, feel a little bit of shameless self-promotion. But it is a good sign if your pride in what you're building overcomes that. And if you genuinely, honestly feel that the person you're talking to would love using this product. And it becomes so much easier to do that, of course, if you're not making money by pitching that. If you actually have a thing that solves their problem and it comes totally out of the goodness of your heart. So that's what we wanted to get to first. And when we go to conferences as a team, we basically all went to GopherCon a few months ago. It's really neat. I mean, people would know that we were from Sourcegraph and we have a lot of users there, but it was not as though we had to get the team together at the beginning and say, all right, let's plan how we're going to go and pitch Sourcegraph. We actually, told the team, like, don't do anything that feels uncomfortable. If someone is talking about something and, you think that there's something cool related to Sourcegraph, even if it's like the language servers that we built that are totally open source and that ship with VS Code and Atom, like, bring them up. But we don't have to dictate like how people do that. I think some other companies have to go and have a plan for all the people they're sending to conferences, and how do you show the ROI from these marketing efforts. But we feel so confident that it's naturally something that our developers love, that other developers love, and so these conversations come up. And so if you take the guilt over shameless self-promotion because you're making money out of it, then it makes it even easier for people to freely talk about it, and share their pride in it. So what I would say is, like, if you're working on a product where you feel like shameful talking about it, then try to find a product where you're really excited about it. Now, it's not to say, what I don't want this to be interpreted as is like, any project that anyone's working on, they should go shamelessly self-promote it and whatever. No, I mean, if you do that and the reactions you get are people being angry, people calling you out, then you're doing it wrong. So don't misinterpret my words there.
So for entrepreneurs or developers that are working on a project, right? Maybe they are indie hackers, right? They are working by themselves on something really cool. Maybe it's a SaaS, maybe it's a tool for developers, and they're thinking about open sourcing it. What's a way that you think that people can think about this that can help them decide whether to open source or not, and when? Do you have any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think that you should look at it as, how do you build the most robust business around something? And if you want your project to be successful, if you think it's going to be successful, then hopefully it would be successful even if you open sourced it. And if that's true, then I would say that is a more robust kind of business than if the only way that it was successful, if it was kind of hanging by a thread, and the only way it was successful is if you kept it closed source. If you think about what are the kinds of defensibility you have in your business, secrecy of code is one thing. I mean, that's like the technology advantage, but that's not actually that good, because all it would take is for some competitor to go and put a few good engineers on writing it. And if that's all it took to, overcome your advantage, then you're probably in a pretty weak position. You might not, have the success that you're dreaming of. But if you can open source it, and if you still have a viable business, then that means that it is a more robust business. That also means you get the benefits of open sourcing, of greater awareness, especially among developers. There's internal communication challenges that being open source makes easier. But one way to think about it is, if you open source it and you're still winning, you're still getting customers, that means you have something else. Maybe it's your amazing vision. Maybe it's your ability to go, market it. Maybe it's your ability to stay ahead of the competition. Maybe it's fundamental network effects in your business or other things like that. Maybe it's your reputation. All those things, your business should be built on those things if you want to make it really big, not just on the secrecy of your code. And then another way to look at it is, again, is going back to the idea that you have a limited number of hours on this planet. And I am pretty sure that being open source will accelerate you finding out whether or not the idea is viable. It's going to mean that more people talk about it, that, potential competitors might try to copy it sooner, and you will see it will be put to the test even sooner than if it languished in relative obscurity because it was not open source. And you always could construct in your mind this, question of, well, maybe it was a good idea, but because I didn't open source it, it never really took off, or, I could always do that in a year. I have the optionality. But if you have the ability, I would say just jettison the optionality, try to make it go and get to the learnings as quickly as possible. I think open source does that very well.
That's great. So right now, Sourcegraph is freemium, right? I read a post from Jason Lemkin where he said that a freemium product would only work if essentially it's a very large market and there's some virality. Sorry, it's a difficult word to pronounce. Is that the case for Sourcegraph? And how do you compare from an economics perspective, like the unit economics and everything of how do you compare freemium and open source? Like they're a little bit related, right? You're giving away some things for free, and in exchange, like you're exchanging awareness for some things that you're giving out for free. How do you compare those? And do you feel like Jason Lemkin's point still makes sense also for open source?
Yeah, absolutely. One decision that was really clear when we were going open source is we probably will not make money on companies that are using our free tier ever. And that's okay. And if you as a company can get by totally on features that are free and open source, then great. That's awesome. I love that you're using our product. I love that because, well, you're getting to build these awesome things, and I can sleep a little bit easier at night knowing that maybe the code that I wrote played a small part in that. And two, you're probably going to go talk about Sourcegraph. So if though as a company you need to have that revenue from these smaller customers, then yeah, it's going to be hard to go open source. But again, I'll go back to this point that it's nice to have a robust business where you can take the bottom 10% of your revenue and say, you know what, we're going to grow more quickly. We're going to let them have it for free. We're going to learn a lot from them. They're going to be some of our most enthusiastic users, but we're not going to charge them. We're going to take, essentially, instead of getting revenue from them, we're going to get other things from them. And it's win-win there. And if that's hard for your business, then you can't go open source. And I would suggest that maybe that business, you should, think about it. How can is that going to yield the success you want if it's so dependent on that bottom slice of your revenue?
And what are your thoughts on patents for open source businesses? Do you feel like is there any use at all and try to protect software with patents, or what kind of advice do you have for that for entrepreneurs?
I think they're totally worthless. I know some investors will say that they're good for signaling, and I have no clue, but it's not something that we spend any time on whatsoever. I am, worried in the back of my mind that is there going to be some non-practicing entity in patents come after us? I'm not worried about that from the big tech companies. I think they would not want to get in that kind of fight. It would be so damaging to their reputation. What I worry about is that some of the big tech companies might find ways to cloak some activity that they would do in the names of other parties. I'm not sure if that's a thing, but that's something I worry about. But in terms of worry, it's like maybe 20 seconds per month no more than that. That's about how long this answer took.
That's great. Um, I guess the final question is, so how do I learn more about Sourcegraph or about you? How do I follow your company on social media?
Go check out our Twitter, SRC Graph, and go to sourcegraph.com. Try our product. Get the browser extension. As I said, that's what we tell people on the sidewalk.
Mm-hmm.
And if you have any questions about why we chose to do certain things with open sourcing, or anything around pricing or business of open source, I would love to answer. Would love to do another video chat like this and post it publicly, or you can just shoot me an email.
Sounds great. Well, thanks a lot, Quinn.
Yeah. Thanks, Eve.